Welcome to Kimecast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work. All right, welcome to Kimecast. I'm Tony Mikla, Russ Dunning, Evan Hauger. So we're going to talk tonight about some in-season baseball training as our main focus. But first, let's talk about what we're drinking here. What we got, Ev?
We have tonight, it's called Blind Pig. It's from Russian River Brewing Company, Northern California. This is a gift from a very strong supporter of ours, Jay Nacionalis, the athletic trainer over at Jesuit High School.
Yes, Jay.
Russ's alma mater.
Yeah.
So he gave us a trio of beers here. This is closer to the holiday season. We're getting around to them now, but we saved them for the podcast.
Love it. Thanks, Jay. So Aaron's not with us tonight, so that's unfortunate. He'd love to talk about this baseball topic, but I think this will be good, and we'll get his opinion in the future another time. But the big thing, I think, when we talk about in-season training as we're approaching this in-season period coming into the spring, for me, if someone asks you, what's the keys to in-season training, my first thought would be like, what'd you do in the off-season? Let's get prepared in the off-season so as you come towards the in-season, you've done all the work. And this kind of goes back to this idea of periodization and looking at the year as an annual cycle when you're working on training with an athlete, that nothing can help someone more than a little bit of time to let the body adapt, let the body change, and you just really can't rush that. So you can't come to the season like many people are now in this COVID era of, hey, I've not done very much for the past 6 months. It's now time to start to play. All of a sudden it's cleared to get out there and start to play perhaps in where you live. And it's like, oh damn, you're either, however you look at that, you should be 6 to 8 weeks away from doing anything all that crazy because you're just asking for problems otherwise. So for me, it's a big deal as far as what'd you do in the off season, and did you prepare yourself and prepare your body properly to be ready to do something in season wise?
And I think if you look at a baseball off season, it's not all that lengthy. Like these guys, if we're talking about pro guys, they're going to be done September, October,
right,
and potentially November if their team does really well.
Yep.
And they show up to spring training in February, so we're talking just a few months. So there's really not a whole lot of stuff that can get done, or you have to be really kind of snappy and precise with what you do. So yeah, the off season's super important, but kind of jam packed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at training, so there's many things to discuss here as far as load and volume. So when I look at a force, or I look at a curve of when to do what in the training program, you really look at an intensity curve and a volume curve, and really they want those to be inversely related. So as your intensity is going up, your volume is typically coming down, right? Or vice versa. If your volume's going up, your intensity is typically going down. So that, in common terms, that would be saying something like 3 sets of 10 or 12 repetitions might be a weight that you can move that many times, so it's going to be a little lower weight, so it's a little lower intensity. Versus 3 sets of 3 repetitions, you'd pick a very, very heavy weight, so it'd be high intensity, but there'd only be 9 total reps with 3 sets of 3, as compared to 30 total reps. And I think this is a big deal when you go from off-season to in-season. When you're in an off-season training program, we want a high-volume load to stimulate hypertrophy, to stimulate muscle change. So we're doing high volume load, high fatigue levels, high recovery needs, where you're looking at 1 to 2 days after a lift where your body's still going to be sore and in a recovery mode. And all of that work is necessary so that when you walk into an in-season time frame and now it's time to focus on the sport, in this case baseball, all of that time is behind you, and now you can do sets of 2 and 3 reps at a very high intensity. But you don't have the correlated soreness that you would normally get from doing something of high volume. But yet you get all the neuro benefits and all the stimulation, and you maintain your strength and perhaps even build some strength in the in-season. But it's definitely not what we used to think it was, 10, 20 years ago. It was like, let's do this maintenance in-season program where you're doing 2 sets of 10, moderate weight. That's gone. There's no purpose for that whatsoever. What we want to be doing in season is high intensity, low volume, only movements that you've previously mastered, and only movements that have very low risk. So you don't end up, doing something that causes a wrist sprain or hurts you in some way, so then you can't practice or you can't play.
And I think a really important point you made there was volume. Like why do we do volume, right? Volume is so we can put on mass, we can grow, we can get bigger, we can get stronger. We need volume for that. you only have, we said this off-season is short, you only have 6 to 8 weeks of time where you can actually load these guys with volume. And then I think about two sort of different curves here. I think of a volume from a sports standpoint and volume from a lifting standpoint. Right. And early in the off-season, the weight room is absolutely the priority, right? And the sport takes a back seat because they've just spent the last 6 months, 62 games playing that to that point. So we've got this weight room priority for probably about 8 weeks where we can load them with a bunch of volume. And then as they need to start getting ready for the season, as December and January start coming around, and that's a different conversation for different guys. An established person showing up spring training that has a spot, has a place to play, they can show up and get ready in spring training. But somebody that's got to show up and prove themselves and earn a spot, they've got to show up peaking. So those are two different programs to write.
Right.
But again, you're up against the clock there, so you've got your volume of your off-season lifting stuff and volume of sport, and those have to do exactly what you said with volume intensity. Is we've got to cross at some point. Baseball or the sport has to start to take over, and the volume of the lifting has to come down, and that's when you can take advantage, like you said, of those higher intensity lifts to still get the neurological benefits and the strength changes.
I think it's good to kind of address the volume part, and I think when the audience or even the therapist thinks volume, we tend to focus on muscle, and I think the bigger focus should be on the connective tissue. When we see injuries that derail careers and derail a season, it's almost always tendon and connective tissue or fascia. Think of like lumbar fascial strains, even disc issues, and of course rotator cuff issues and UCL ligament issues. And we can augment connective tissue with volume. So, in my mind, I'm thinking of our prior podcast with Johnny Owens, and he'll talk about BFR creating a blooming effect at the cell. And that blooming effect of the cell that signals an uptick in growth hormone and gives you tissue growth comes from a lot of load with a intermittent rest, and you get that like lactic pump. Your muscle swells, you feel it swelling, you feel it fatiguing. It is that old school kind of like lactic acid, the bro gym world where you love that pump. There is that volume, and it serves a purpose sometimes, but there's also a part of just building in lots of volume without necessarily the pump, and that's where the tendon fortification comes, and it comes with sneaking in volume after volume, and that could be swing or throw, that could be squat or hang clean or lunge. And it's our job to kind of help fortify the body to make it resilient by getting in volume, which can lead to both muscle growth as well as tendon fortification and ligamentous fortification to be able to handle the stress of high-intensity sport to come.
Yeah, that's really good. That's a great point. I think that so we're talking about in season here, though, right? So that's kind of the off-season look of volume. Volume leaves the picture when we get to in season. And so what you're left with is different positions that can probably attack this stuff differently. On a previous podcast with Lucas Giolito, he detailed out he's a starting pitcher, and he detailed out his 5-day routine. So he throws every 5th day, which is probably about once a week in pro baseball world. And if you go to college, those guys, there's a weekend starter. Starting pitcher will throw 1 day a week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And we'll have to do it again to the next week. High school, similar idea, unless they're playing another position. So those guys' season could be attacked a little bit differently than the shortstop that has to go out there and play every single day, right? So the starting pitcher can get a bigger, probably more voluminous lift. Is voluminous a word?
Do it.
Can we take it? Can we take it? All right. So a more voluminous lift, a higher volume lift, in that. Yep, there we go. In that 5-day period. And it still works very well. And he talks about his. Go back and look at that podcast. I thought that was really impactful to hear all of that stuff from him. But then the shortstop is playing every single day in their in-season program. Not only are we going to have to tailor volume down, but we might have to change some exercises. So we might have to do things that we have to manage their eccentric stressors. So if they were doing like a rear foot elevated split squat, that could turn into like a step up or something that does not have nearly the same eccentric load on them, because we know that those eccentric loads are going to be the things that'll make them sore the following day. And if he's got to play 6 games a week, we don't have time in the weight room to get him sore.
And that soreness comes with tension.
Yeah.
It won't just be kind of man up, do it because you're sore. It's like, the tissue gets tight, and consequently they're less athletic during that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
such a good point. I think there's some great things to consider here too, as far as the length of the season is also a big factor. You know, we look at the major league guys, the MLB, or even the minor leaguers. I mean, they're in season for 8 or 9 months, which is a heck of a stretch, you know. Versus if maybe a high school or a collegiate guy is in season for 4 to 5 months, which is
They're still relatively in season for that long too, though, right? So, I mean, they'll play their high school or college season, and then the college guys, the good ones, go play in the Cape or go play summer league, and then they have fall league starting when they get back to school. The high school kids are doing relatively the same thing with their travel team, so
yeah, doing their showcases and
Yeah.
such. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good point.
the volume is there.
Yeah, and just considering as you go through those kinds of long-term stretches, like how you maintain it, I don't think I would say that the beginning of your in-season and the middle of your in-season and the end of your in-season all look the same either. There should be some cycles within that where you're going to have some moments with a bit of a higher volume load and moments where you're going to have more of an intensity load even within those microcycles of that time frame. Otherwise, it's just going to be kind of a stagnant situation. So you really have to kind of look at what's your priorities, what's your goals, what's the goals of the team. Are you on a team that's competing for a championship where the postseason is really your focal point, or are you in a team where you're really earning a spot to make it to the postseason? So maybe there's a little bit different in where your priorities and where you can essentially choose maybe to be a little bit underperforming on the field to sacrifice the fact to build your body up a little bit so that you can perform on the field at a higher level a little bit later. I think those are all decisions that we have to make as a coach and as an athlete, and it's the reality of it. I would say to simplify all of this too, one thing that we're looking for outside of like the economics of this and kind of the metrics of it is a feeling. And one thing that I've observed in my time when I was at Arizona with the basketball team and since then with other elite athletes is when you're in the weight room in the off season, the goal is to leave the weight room like you can barely walk, you know, exhausted, maximal fatigue. That's the hardest thing you did all week, you know, and you're going to pay for that for 2 days. When you're in season environment, you want to leave the weight room energized, feeling fresh, like someone just turned the lights on, like boom, let's go, I'm ready to go take it and let's get after it. So you should leave with more energy than you entered during an in-season workout, whereas in an off-season workout, you're going to leave with far less energy and feel completely depleted. And when you're having those types of sensations, then you're in the right metrics. You know, you're getting the right load.
To kind of put some context to that, because I love that, I do think of deposits. When we're out of season, we've got a few months to rebuild. It's deposits that are for the future, because those hard workouts with high volume, medium intensity, lots of load, and you are kind of dead after a workout, that's a deposit for 6 weeks from now. You're not gonna get those returns. You just won't. Doesn't matter how well you crushed it. But yeah, that 3 sets of 3, 3 sets of 2, more in season. Say your percentage is working at 85% with a hang clean or a squat or some kind of push press, and 3 sets of 2 after 1 or 2 priming sets is not a lot. You're done with it in like 10-15 minutes. Maybe you add a little dynamic warm-up in there, maybe a little med ball core rotation stuff. Really, 30-40 minutes, and you feel like, man, I'm just getting started. Yeah. And that is a short-term deposit. That's a deposit so that in 3 days I'm primed. And maybe even later on, I'm gonna go out into the field, I'm gonna throw some heat, or I'm gonna swing the bat the hardest I can. It primes you, and it's a short realization of that gain, whereas the other one is long deposits. Those are for the future.
Yeah. And there may be a shift in kind of where your focus is. So that was a good point on the session kind of being shorter, right? So in the off season, you might spend 90 minutes in the weight room, completely exhausting yourself, to your point, and then you're getting primed here in 30 to 40 minutes and ready to go. But maybe you're having to spend more time in season, again, managing some of the stresses of the sport, right? So if we're talking baseball, these guys are doing the same thing repetitively over and over again. If it's a right-handed thrower and a right-handed hitter, he's going to rotate to the left. I mean, thousands to millions of times, right, over the course of a season. So it's the same repetitive stress over and over again. He's probably going to run into some simple and similar mobility issues that he can get pretty comfortable with. And some of his maybe weight room time or what would have been his 90-minute workout time can be dedicated to that. And whatever level somebody's at is going to dictate how that's attacked. If you're in major league level, you're going to have a training staff that's dedicated to kind of keeping you on the field and soft tissue stuff to help you. if you're in minor league levels and college and high school, you're gonna have to kind of figure a lot of it out for yourself. So one thing that we've talked a lot about with our athletes in our facilities is self-checks. So very quick self-assessment, so they can say, am I the best version of myself today? And if I'm not, what do I have to do to earn it?
You know, I think it's so important to think of both in the short term, 3, 6, 9 months, you know, in that season. And so say for, you know, a sophomore in high school, or your 2-year in your college program, and you're thinking, well, this is where I'm at this year. This is where I want to be next year. So we have the off-season development and you have your in-season training. But maybe for some athletes, they're still in a bit of that high volume load through the season, because going back to your point, they're going to sacrifice. They're going to say, I might underperform a little bit because I got my potential here. Maybe they're 19 years old with growth hormone going through the roof. Why waste that on some simple high neuro training? And I think it does go always down to priorities. And if you're not actively picking your priorities, that means you just let someone else pick them for you. And it was probably the board and the gym, or worse yet, what you stole online. So you got to pick your priorities. What are we doing? Where are we at? And do that well. And if you can't answer that, then you're probably going to be lost, whether it's off season or in season.
Yeah, and what makes you the best version of yourself on any given day? When we're talking about a long season, I always think of this like fuel tank, right? And after the first month, that thing's never full. It's just how is yours, and everybody's good, right? Everybody's similar levels there. It's just, is yours a little more full than the other guy? And so that's where recovery comes into, I think, to be a huge point here. And when you talk about a long baseball season, these guys have a very hard time maintaining weight. Now, they can fluctuate both sides of things, but in pros and college, with insane travel and schedule, and even high school, I mean, these kids are, you know, doing a million things. They've got school to manage and travel to manage, that, you know, guys on hard time keeping their weight down, like things like fast food and other stuff becomes easy and they go that direction. And guys have a hard time keeping their weight up, and in the off season they're able to meal prep and plan everything out. When the season hits, that's not there anymore. So it's like you have to reset, find a new plan, a new program to get yourself on to maintain. But a lot of the pro guys will go into their season 10 to 15 pounds more than where they expect to be when the season ends. And so they plan to start bigger.
Definitely see that change.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's cool too, depending on what type of athlete you're working with, in baseball, if it's a pitcher, or if any other sport, like an individual athlete like track and field, or maybe a tennis player that has like an individual focus, and they're going to go out and perform for a somewhat of a singular event, or maybe a tournament over a week or a certain period of time. One thing you can really do when you really mastered this off-season prep work, when you get into the in-season, is you can use these neurological stimulants, like we were talking about a little bit ago. Russ mentioned like a medicine ball throw, or doing some high-intensity stuff that's low on the volume side. So we did this a ton when I was training Steph Trafton, and we were training for the Olympics. Our off-season with her was building high volume, high strength, and we moved into more of a power phase and an explosive phase right before the season, which is more like Olympic lifting, snatch, power cleans, things like that. And when we're still doing moderate volumes of those things, maybe like 4 sets of 4, 4 sets of 5, where we're still moving a load, and there's high rest in between each load, and it's fairly exhaustive before we actually started throwing season. But because we mastered the lifts at those times, we mastered the loads, and we built the strength up, built the tissue quality up, when it came time to compete, let's say we had a competition on Friday. Usually we'd have a pre-competition on Friday, and then the secondary competition would be Saturday or Sunday. So there's always like a pre-qualifier, and then there was a final essentially at the elite track meets. So what we would do is go in and we'd say, all right, on Wednesday, maybe even Thursday, depending on the meet, we'd get a lift in. And that lift would look like, if we had access to a weight room, we'd look at it like a power clean or a snatch. You might do 2 or 3 sets of 2. Or we're lifting something heavy, something we've lifted several times in the past, just to get a big explosive movement, get this really high power moment out of it. If we didn't have that, we'd go to a medicine ball throw, so we'd actually travel with med balls, or we could throw a med ball for height, or rotationally throw a med ball off a wall, or throw for distance rotationally, and just get 3 to 5 reps of really explosive, high speed, high movement, especially after coming off travel or coming off a plane, to kind of get that system firing again, so that the next day going into the competition, we'd be sharp. The system would be sharp. The system would be activated, be ready to go. And even prior to competition, within an hour and a half, 2 hours of competition, if we can get something explosive in that case, like a shot put or a discus type throw, if we get something explosive in, like a jump or a med ball throw or something to kind of prime the system, say, boom, let's go, let's turn it on, let's get after it, is a big deal, makes a huge impact on the athlete, and then carry that into their warm-ups and onto the track type stuff. So that works out great for that environment. But we see the same thing in pitching, where Lucas did a great job of kind of speaking out his 5-day prep, and that was part of the sequencing, was to get lifts in there scheduled, so that when he went into his pitching day, he was ready to go. System was fired, system was prepped and ready.
There's a lot to it. I think I love talking nervous system, because as we always talk, it kind of is the master behind everything. It's the master behind tone, it's the master behind recovery, it's the master behind mindset. And I think when we really could have nailed these neural workouts, they really set a good base, because to some degree they can become part of your warm up and your prep routine. Other times they can become part of your volume and your deep deposits of off-season training. But mastering the patterns that are meaningful to that athlete is absolutely essential, and that speaks to training history. And if you're not working on the patterns that are meaningful to you, whether it is a high clean squat, some push press or a med ball throw, there's really not that many lifts and patterns to pull from, and perhaps every athlete, besides synchronized swimming, should be doing the majority of them. I think it's so critical that you get that training history in, so that you have those tools when you need them the most. Because like we said, in-season training is the wrong time to learn something new, try it out, and possibly suffer the consequences of faulty form, or you're just not used to it.
Right. Yeah, that's an awesome point. I think the one time though where things, so we're really kind of talking about relatively maintaining and maybe some small strength gains over a long season like that. But that might change when you're looking at like a youth athlete, right? A high school kid or even a younger kid, right? So these kids they could grow 4 or 5 inches over the course of this season. That might be a lot, but they could grow over the course of this season. They've got bodies maturing, more testosterone flowing through their body. I mean, these kids could make true strength gains over the course of a season. So I think you kind of have to look at the training age point you made there was really good, and almost anything you throw at that 14 or 15-year-old Bambi-looking kid that has no muscle on his body yet is going to help him grow and help him change, and even in season those kids can make pretty significant gains.
Right, to the point on that is the sport probably isn't as intense at that age group as it is even as you get into later high school years. You start to have an intensity around the moment, around the game, around the velocity of the game. Yeah. Where at that age, everything's a little bit slower. And certainly there's some kids better than others and more advanced in their development. But yeah, I think that's always super good to consider. Is that it's less of a factor, but still a consideration. Yeah. Because if you are putting folks out there in fatigue states and sore states, then you're going to ask for problems no matter what age group they're in. So I think it's a really good consideration as you're looking at building. If you're the coach or if you're the person building these programs for your athletes, consider when you're in the off season, when you're building your off season program, what do you want to do in season? What would be your neuro prep activities? What would be some of your high intensity activities that you want to help develop and maintain strength during that period? And then kind of work backwards through your off season. Make sure those drills and those movements are in your off season program, because it is critical. So one of the biggest mistakes we see is that someone gets a little bit bored with their training program, or they want to try something new, and they do it in season, and maybe they make a small mistake, or they load it a little bit heavy, and now they've got a minor oblique strain, or maybe their back's a little bit sore, maybe they're doing a movement where they tweak their wrist just a little bit, and now their throwing arm is sore, having nothing to do with their sport, but because of a weight room issue. And of course they still play through that, and then it mounts, and it can end up being very, very costly. So you really want to make sure that you're prepping that in-season workout with those movements in the off-season, mastering the form, mastering the technique, mastering the resilience of that tissue to tolerate those movements. And then when it comes time to in-season to do it, it's like, I've done this all day, and I should be bored in the weight room, but I should get excited about the intensity of it. And then if you want to go learn something new, do that on the field. That's what the in-season's all about. Mm-hmm. Skill development and skill acquisition and mastering those skills over that period of time. That's where the focus should be.
When it comes to lifts, as you talk, and we use the word intensity and volume almost too casually. And if I have a collegiate athlete and we're doing something, and I'll ask, well, what's your normal training load here? And they'll just look at me and just go blink, blink. I just do whatever the paper says. Oh, you don't know? You don't know your training load? And speaking to training history, if you don't know your training load, if you don't know some estimate of your 1 rep max, not to say I think everyone should be doing them, they need to know what your potential is to even have an understanding of what a high neural load will be. because it's quite impossible to look at any athlete and know their position and say, well, you should be here. We're going to do 3 sets of 5 with a front squat underneath the barbell. You can't do that. You have to base it on training history, on numbers, on a proven record to actually have something meaningful, at least with some barbell activity. And perhaps that's why I like med balls so much, because they're frankly a hell of a lot safer. You can grab 4, 8, 12 pounds and make that thing fly. And you don't have to be quite so worried because you're operating on a different end of the force velocity spectrum. But nonetheless, I'm not sure if we want to go down that topic, but it speaks to training history. And if ever we're working with someone, if you get an idea that you don't have a good training history by the athlete not knowing their numbers or knowing their lifts or showing competency with the pattern, then there's no neural activation. They're actually still learning.
Yeah.
It's not neural activation if you're still learning it. That's neural education, not activation. And that's a big theme as we kind of even a high level athlete. We shouldn't say, oh, just because they're in the MLB they know how to do a power clean.
No, and you better believe a lot of them are pretty deficient in a lot of things. Like, I mean, people that get to these high levels sometimes don't get there because of the work they've put in the weight room. Some of these guys are just, freak athletes or just really good at something, and they end up in these positions. I remember this old thing I looked at. This is probably a while ago now, but Usain Bolt's training program was made public. I remember looking at it and being like, I think I was an undergrad at the time, learning like how to write out these programs and how to do all this stuff. And I remember looking at it and thinking, this doesn't make any sense to me. None of this makes sense. But could you question Usain Bolt's training program? He's the fastest man in the world. If he came to you and said, this is what I'm doing, would you nod and say, sounds good, buddy? Or would you say, let's change this?
No, so the scouts have gotten really good to find good talent raw.
Yes, very raw.
And bring that up. And it's very rarely correlated with high levels of work in the weight room, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many considerations here as you're looking through it and working through your process and what's important. But like Russ said earlier, what's your priorities? Where do you want to focus your time? Look at building those building blocks in early in your off-season program so it can really set you up for your in-season is really at the end of the day. And I think you want to look at this inverse relationship with this force velocity curve, force velocity or intensity volume curve is really where we're at. So the higher the intensity, the lower the volume, and vice versa is a big one. And as Evan mentioned earlier, this idea of what's your priorities for? What's your focus on skill development in your sport versus lifting load? So.
Yeah, and I always think of it and describe it as how can the weight room complement the sport? And so when the sport is not the priority, the weight room can take over. As the sport becomes more of the priority, your complement is to decrease in your volume. As we already said, intensity can go up. Maybe we're managing tissue stress is different. But how can you complement what's happening on the field? Because at the end of the day, that's the only reason they're there. And I think sometimes in the strength coach world, we get a little too maybe nerdy on how we're doing things and think we're in control of more than is actually happening. At the end of the day, what they do on the field matters more. And if they never even showed up to see us and they still, they hit 40 home runs, I mean,
that's okay.
That's it.
I think that's important too when you look at the end of the day. Like what we're talking about here is this idea of performance and how do you maximize and improve performance, and that's what this is all about. And you've obviously heard a theme of, modulating intensity and volume and ramping things up and looking at other variables to control how intense you get and all of these controls we look at when we look at the big picture. And this is really important because I think we look at typical training that's going on now, and there's a variety of options out there. And I think when you look at folks that are doing performance-based work, it's typically based on setting up an annual-based program and really focusing on development of certain things at certain times. And it's truly spectacular to watch it work and watch the human body change with those type of programs. And there's other programs that really believe in this like chaos theory or like this kind of randomization of developing resilience and throwing anything at people in the different random times, which has a place, but you have to be very, very careful of when that's used and how that's used, because my experience, my approach to training is that the chaos is the sport. Like, so for basketball or baseball, I can't necessarily predict what's going to go on the field. My job is to prepare that athlete for whatever does happen on the field. I prepared him for it. So if it's a linear movement, a lateral movement, a rotational movement, a diving movement, a sliding movement, whatever it might be, we've done some work to prepare his body to fortify him for that development. but I don't make my weight room environment chaotic because that's high risk. So when you're working with an athlete that's working at performance-oriented goals, it's a strong consideration. We get that question quite a bit. Should I do a workout that's a little more chaotic in nature? It's fun and it's stimulating, and I feel like I got my ass kicked during it. Does that make you a better athlete? And that's not the nature that we come from in this approach. Is that if you want the best ass-kicking workout, then you're probably not looking at it. We're not trying to improve your performance outside of the workout. The performance is the workout, and that's its own challenge, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, prioritize. Do you want that? Get my ass kicked in the workout, or do you want to go kick ass in the field? Those are probably two different things. That if they exist simultaneously, then you'll end up seeing us on the rehabilitation side, almost guaranteed.
And that's the difference of a lack of testing, because if you had testing, you had an objective. What are we doing? What is our priority? And then you develop a test behind that. And if you train chaos, what's the test?
Right. What are we doing?
Because sports chaos, and who wins? How many times does the ball go over the fence? How many times do you throw it down in the hoop? That's the chaos.
That's what they call it. Throw it down in the
Throw it
hoop.
down in
Sorry,
the
I didn't
hoop.
cut you off.
Throw it
In
down.
wrestler's world, you might live in the most chaotic training environment.
The most.
With these UFC guys,
Yeah.
is that,
Yeah.
and we see this extensively with the UFC training programs. That obviously we can't control what goes on in the ring, and Russ has broken down the movements to what you can predict. We can anticipate the style of fighter the person is, the style of fighter their opponent might be, what positions they might end up in, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses of each athlete, and then putting together programs in the off season to do that. And we've seen great success with that, but we also see great struggle in athletes that may be new to this type of strategy, come from other camps or such, and they have this kind of chaos theory in their own camp. So they go through like 8 weeks of chaos to get ready for the chaos in the ring, and then end up hurt often in that process. And it's like we're not really performance trained at that time. We're kind of just trying to survive the camp, which doesn't prove to be the most successful way to survive the competition.
Yep. So whether it's a pitcher or a fielder or a fighter, the science part of our therapy mind and our coaching mind is what does the body need to be able to do? If they can do it, great. Let's help keep that as powerful, as fast, as strong as possible. If they can't do it, then we got to fortify the body to be able to do that, to tolerate season, and those should be pretty straightforward. There's really not that many fundamental patterns the body can do, and that's our job in the weight room and in the recovery room to maintain the mobility of the segments, maintain the fascial line integrity, maintain the strength and neural coordination. It's really not that hard if you have a priority list.
Yeah.
Well, good. So good luck out there with your in-season programs as we kind of enter this spring, and we're kind of coming around through it. So if you guys need any guidance or any other tips, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to help you and get after it. But remember that if you're asking an in-season question, it probably should have been solved 6 months ago. But we'll do our best to help you through the process and make you focus your efforts on the right way to go.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks for the beer, Jay. You're watching Kimecast. Thank you. This was Kimecast, and we are the Kime Human Performance Institute. Thank you very much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Please hop on our social media. It's at KimeHPI, and engage with us there. If you'd like us to feature a topic or answer any questions live on the show, post your comments there. You can also check us out on our website at kimeperformance.com, and there you can see links to content that we've posted throughout our podcast for more information.